Thanks for joining me. My name is Doug Lipton. I'm the Senior Research Scientist for Economics at NOAA Fisheries in the US. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of our experiences in the US with applying socioeconomic analysis to impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we faced, some of the actions we took, and some of the lessons we've learned. I'm not going to talk today about what the impacts were. Focus today is on the process and the role that economics and social science can play in helping to deal with a crisis like this. Well, I said I wasn't going to talk about impacts. I just wanted to give you a feel for the magnitude. So in the US, about 65% of our seafood expenditures occur away from home, mostly at restaurants. And this chart here shows the huge decline in spending overall at restaurants in the US through the end of July. It might be helpful to use the analogy of a major hurricane moving at slow motion and trying to figure out where it's going to make landfall and what the impacts are going to be in the short and long run. Unfortunately, in the US, we have a bit of experience on our East Coast in the Gulf of Mexico in doing these types of rapid assessments of damages. So whether we're talking about a hurricane or COVID-19, there's usually an immediate need to get information about what's in its path or where the likely damages are to occur. So we need to get baseline information on activities so that we can get resources where they're needed right away. Then as more information becomes available over the coming months, we need to re-examine what the actual damages were and what the long-term impacts are going to be. And then over the years, we need to look at our policies and see how we can arm ourselves better so we can mitigate impacts of future disasters. So we embarked on 4 different activities to meet these different time frame needs. I'm not going to talk about the research agenda, that's still unfolding. I will talk about our work on calculating baselines of the industry, doing industry snapshots, and developing scenarios. So one of the big drivers of the need for immediate information was the passage of the CARES Act. This was passed at the end of March and provided over $2 trillion in economic stimulus. So a lot of the general provisions of the act applied to industries of all types, and the marine and seafood businesses were potentially eligible. So fortunately, we had the National Sea Grant Law Center help us identify how seafood and marine businesses could take advantage of some of these provisions, such as the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a forgivable loan if a business kept employees on their payroll, whether or not you could apply for unemployment or special pandemic unemployment, which applied to independent contractors, which are the way fishing crews are normally paid. And the Sea Grant Law Center helped us figure out what provisions were applicable to the seafood industry and how they would work. And they held workshops and seminars in order to get that information out to the Sea Grant Network. For those of you who don't know, in the US, the Sea Grant Network is a partnership between the federal government, state governments, and universities to provide marine and coastal research and outreach to decision makers in the various states throughout the US. Now, in addition to those general provisions, there was a specific provision, a section that was specifically targeted to fishery participants. And this is where NOAA Fisheries came in helping to distribute about $300 million out to the US states to eligible participants. For the CARES Act, we had to develop baselines of what would be normal activity across a wide range of seafood and marine sectors. So within the seafood sector, we not only included capture fisheries, but also aquaculture. Aquaculture was a little bit challenging because the US Department of Agriculture also has responsibilities for aquaculture, but mostly freshwater aquaculture, whereas the marine aquaculture responsibility was given to NOAA Fisheries. There are tribal fisheries that have to be accounted for, the processing sector, and even imports when they're processed into value-added products counted. And then on the recreational side, I've mentioned earlier, the for-hire sector with charter boat fishermen and party boats also being eligible for CARES Act funding. And this all had to be done at the state level. So it was a big lift in terms of doing data analysis. So once we completed developing the baseline information for distribution of the $300 million from the CARES Act to the various states, we needed to determine what kinds of impacts we were actually seeing. Now, there were plenty of media and industry reports, but these are not typically representative of what's going on industry-wide. So where we were pre-authorized, and this pre-authorization came actually from our hurricane analogy, where we've been allowed to go and do short-term disaster evaluations, we were able to conduct formal surveys. In other areas on the West Coast, in Alaska and Hawaii, we had to rely more on key stakeholder interviews and representative data that way. And then for aquaculture, again, we partnered with our Sea Grant community. They conducted an aquaculture survey of both freshwater and marine aquaculture, and were able to provide us with information about impacts on that sector of the economy. The scenario analysis is the one activity I've been most involved in. So when this baseline information was being collected for the CARES Act, I started looking at it at a monthly basis and then started wondering, well, what's going to happen as the pandemic plays out? And so at the end of March, beginning of April, I started trying to put this data together. Of course, there wasn't really much data. We just had the news reports, as I was talking about. We hadn't yet had the snapshots. But I took the information that our regions were bringing forward and put it into a national model, and then just made guesses on the evolution of impacts, both on their severity, because we didn't have actual impacts at the time, and when things would likely return to normal. So at the time, my thinking was, well, is this going to be over in June or July? And is it going to linger a little bit, with a small impact throughout the remainder of the year? Now, as we're pulling together the data in September, first of all, we have some actual landings and revenue data in some of our fisheries and not in all of them. So we have observed impacts. So we can see what the impacts are from the different levels of shutdowns. And we can now start to make more educated guesses on the severity of the impacts, as well as the time frame in which they're going to play out. So we're continuing to update these and look at what's at stake in the future if things continue the way they are or as they improve. I think we continue to face and meet a variety of challenges. So one is the different audiences that need our information, whether it's the industry or politicians and managers. And again, they need these at very different timescales. So we're doing a lot of things at once. We need systematic representative measures of impacts. What we have readily are media and industry reports. We need to rely on the economic data that is often lagged. I look with jealousy at the European Monitor for Fisheries and Aquaculture, which is able to produce weekly reports. We don't have that kind of public surveillance of our seafood and fishing industries in the US. And we face the challenge of assessing the damage while the quote hurricane is still going on, and the usual bureaucratic challenges, our ability to do surveys in areas where we don't have pre-authorization has been a challenge, getting data at the level we need it, and again, in a timely way. Anyway, I thank you for your time. Look forward to hearing your questions.